very easily is the scapula. And this is actually a fairly complex bone. So if you look at it, you've got your dorsal surface, which has got a lot of elevations to it, and your ventral surface, which is fairly smooth. The ventral surface sits right against the rib cage, so it's smooth to allow it to glide past the ribs. This surface is called the subscapular, and because the surface is a depression, subscapular fossa. Now, what comes off of this bone at this point is a muscle we're going to learn about later on called the subscapularis. On the dorsal side, we have an upper and lower depression divided by this blade of bone. And this is called the spine of the scapula. Now, when we get into this in lecture, you're going to see that the spine of the scapula is really the supraspinous bone or cartilage of other animals fusing to the scapula. So a lot of what makes a mammal scapula confusing is it's made up of other components fusing to it. But above the spine, we have a depression called supraspinous fossa. Below the spine, we have a depression called infraspinous fossa. A muscle comes off here called the supraspinatus. A muscle comes off here called the infraspinatus. And all those are part of your rotator cuff muscles. Now, the spine has a projection right here called the acromion. The rotator cuff is called that because your shoulder is not as locked in as your hip. And so the muscles and bones are loosely attached, so you have a rotator cuff with muscles around that. The cat's acromion is fairly pointy. Your acromion is this whole thing on your shoulder right here that is right about where an epaulet of a military shirt would be. In fact, your spine and your acromion together are like the stick and the blade of a hockey stick. But because they have less of an attachment, they need an extra one to the side, which we have here, the metacromion. Now we get to the articulating surface, which is called the glenoid. Associated with this articulating surface is this projection that looks like the beak of a crow. A little piece of string on here blocking your view, but there it is. That's called coracoid process. Coracoid means crow's beak. In humans, it looks a lot more like a crow's beak. Now, this is actually the coracoid of your mud puppy that's been reduced and attached to the scapula to make this process. So one of the things we'll learn about in lecture is that the coracoid and the clavicle do pretty much the same thing. They both brace the anterior aspect of the pectoral girdle. So if you have one, you don't need the other. So over evolutionary time, terrestrial vertebrates have either kept the clavicle and dumped the coracoid, or kept the coracoid and dumped the clavicle. Here we see the coracoid just being a reducible projection. And then this would be the border that's in the armpit, the axillary border. And there's a projection right here, which I won't worry about for the practical, but it's going to come up in the muscles later on. This projection's below the glenoid, so it's called the infraglenoid, and it's a rounded elevation. Rounded elevations are called tubercles, right, like a pimple on the bone. So this is the infraglenoid tubercle. All right, why do we care about that? If you look at a bodybuilder with well-defined